eyes in the sky, gazing far into the night. I raise my hand to the fire, but it's no use, 'cause you can't stop it from shining through. It's true, baby, let the light shine through. If you believe it's true, baby, won't you let the light shine through for you, for you, for you, for you, for
Hi everyone, welcome to Deception Detection Radio. I'm Kay.
And I'm Chad.
We pray you all had a blessed week. Tonight, it's our pleasure to welcome researcher and best-selling author Peter Levenda to Deception Detection Radio. Welcome, Peter. It's wonderful to have you join us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's great that you've been able to take the time, and we're very excited to be able to speak with you tonight. I'm going to go ahead and say the opening prayer, and then we'll get into our discussion. Okay, everybody ready?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Dear Father in heaven, you have given us so many blessings, and we want to thank you for that and for giving us the opportunity to share your word and to help expose the dark side so that people know the truth and they get away from these lies. And we know, Father, that you shine the light on the darkness that's out there. And we thank you. You are an awesome and mighty God. We ask you to open the ears of our listeners and to soften their hearts and to just guide tonight's broadcast. We ask you this, Father, in Jesus' holy and mighty name. Amen. Well, Peter, you've written so many books and you've done so much research. Could you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. Of course, my name is Peter Levenda. I'm a native of New York City, and I've lived all around the world during my life so far. I've traveled through probably more than 40 countries. I've lived in a few of them. And during the course of all of that, I was working in international trade. I did a lot of business overseas for the most part, starting in the 1970s, but really gearing up in the 1980s. And that allowed me to meet a lot of different people from all different walks of life all around the world. And at the same time, continue in the background my own research into the things that fascinated me, which mostly is the connection between religion and politics, in particular extreme forms of religion, religious extremism and political extremism, to see how they match up and what are some of the underlying similarities between these worldviews. So it's my work was probably inspired in large part by what was going on in the 1960s as I was growing up in the 1970s with the assassinations in the 60s, and then with Watergate in the 70s, and on and on. So I began to see connections between people and events and places and ideas, and that led me into this career of looking for those dots to connect between all of these various things. So I began to research the Third Reich and Nazism in a very big way. I went to South America in 1979, researching a mysterious estate in the Andes Mountains called Colonia Dignidad, which is in the south of Chile, south of Santiago. And I was detained there briefly. I had my passport taken away from me and film taken out of my camera and that sort of thing before I was basically told to leave the country and was put on the next plane out of Chile. And that became the basis for the first book I published called Unholy Alliance. And it went on from there. Sinister Forces was really an outgrowth of all of that. Unholy Alliance was designed to be just a chapter of Sinister Forces, but it became an entire book by itself. And then I wrote the Sinister Forces Trilogy and on and on. I got a master's degree in religious studies and in Asian studies very late in life, around 2007. And I've been writing a lot about religion, politics, history since then.
You've gotten pretty deep on Lovecraft. You've got 2 books on Lovecraft. Could you give a brief description of both of those and talk a little bit about the newest one, the Lovecraft Code?
Sure. The first one is a nonfiction book called The Dark Lord. And what I do with that is try to understand the belief systems that that Lovecraft represents in his stories. People think of Lovecraft, of course, as a writer of fiction, which, of course, he was. He wrote a lot of short stories, some of them longer than others, but for the most part, he was a short story writer. And he was an atheist. And he believed very much in science over religion. He had a deep distrust of religion of any kind. And at the same time, he grew up in a household that was very, very strange, very unique in Providence, Rhode Island. His father went insane very early on, and his mother eventually followed suit in her own way, also becoming extremely psychotic and had to be hospitalized. So Lovecraft is growing up in this environment of people who are not sane, and at the same time he's holding on to atheism as kind of a rock in that storm. And writing stories, however, that allude to darker realities, things that lurk beneath the surface, the possibility that the Earth had been visited in ancient times, long in prehistoric times, by beings from some other planet or some other galaxy, and they may come back again, and that there may be people on the planet who are in contact with these unseen beings. That was sort of a hallmark of many of his stories, this idea of a hidden cabal of humans who might, through using occult means, be in contact with alien forces. So he was anticipating a lot of what happened in popular media in the 20th century with people like Erich von Däniken and Zecharia Sitchin and people like that who were writing about an ancient alien theory. So he's fascinating for that particular reason. Here's someone who's against all spirituality and against religion in general, who's a self-proclaimed atheist, and yet he's very consumed by these questions of light versus darkness and the danger that alien beings may present to the human race. And so a lot of his themes were picked up by occultists, actual practicing magicians, people like Kenneth Grant, and to a certain extent, peripherally, Aleister-Crowley, the famous bugaboo, the wickedest man in the world, quote unquote. So you had a lot of focus on Lovecraft by actual practicing occultists. Like, is Lovecraft speaking the truth about this? Is he on to something? And so you had occultists in England who were deliberately trying to use the Lovecraft stories as a kind of an environment or a template for working their own occult research. And so my book on that is called The Dark Lord. And I explore all of these ideas of Lovecraft and how Kenneth Grant and Aleister-Crowley are brought into the conversation and trying to understand Lovecraft's point of view. But I realized that in doing that, I was dealing with material that's pretty heavy. And it's a lot of footnotes, and a lot of background research in different languages and different cultures, which may be bewildering to people. And as I was doing the Dark Lord, the idea for a Lovecraft Code was always in the back of my mind, a novel based on Lovecraft's most famous story, The Call of Cthulhu, and trying to use that in a modern 21st century setting to show involvement of terrorist groups in the Middle East and in Central Asia, religious extremism, and a central character who's a professor of religious studies, who then becomes disillusioned by religion because of his confrontation with a massacre that he witnesses in Iraq. And now he starts to question his own faith. And he becomes more and more atheistic as time goes on. He rejects religion in much the same way that other authors have done, nonfiction authors, people like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens, people who have turned against religion because of what they perceive to be its frailties or its weaknesses. My central character, Gregory Angel, does the same thing. He's turned off from all religion because of what he witnessed in Iraq. And through this course of the novel, and in the sequels that will follow, the central character finds his lack of faith being challenged, whereas his faith had been challenged previously. Now it's his lack of faith that's being challenged in ways he did not expect.
Interesting.
Curious about H.P. Lovecraft. He suffered from night terrors and the sleep paralysis. As a Christian, we believe that those are from demons. Do you believe that those influenced his writing, or do you believe that the writing influenced the symptoms of the night terrors and the sleep paralysis?
Well, the dreams happened first. I mean, he had the nightmares when he was a child. It started then. And some of the terms and some of the ideas that he developed in his earlier stories came directly out of those dreams and nightmares. So some of the most famous characters in his work were names and concepts and general feelings of anxiety, of like an existential anxiety that he had from his dreams as a child. So this was right there. This was in the beginning. And it might have been, in a sense, triggered by some of the things that he read as opposed to what he wrote. He read a lot of, for instance, Richard Burton's 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights. So he read about that, and that might have influenced some of his ideas about Arabs and Arabia and the Middle East. Later, as he grew older, he started to read more non-fictional sources as well. Probably read one of William Seabrook's works on traveling through the Middle East, which mentions the Yazidi, a cult that's supposed to be a cult of devil worshippers. Mm-hmm. And this cult then shows up in Lovecraft's writing later on. So I think it's symbiotic. I think his night terrors and his nightmares gave him the fuel and the raw material for some of his stories. But I think that as he became more and more involved in writing these stories, it was symbiotic. Then he became more and more focused on these issues and focused on this stuff. It fed into each other, I think. And you put that in the context of his background, which was very isolated. He was a very isolated guy. He never finished high school. He dropped out. It doomed his dreams of becoming an astronomer. So he was a homebody. He was a recluse. He was kind of sickly early on. And I think all of this together made him extremely sensitive to these ideas.
And one of the names that you brought up a while ago, Kenneth Grant. Could you talk a little bit about Kenneth Grant? Because there's a lot of people out there, they know who Aleister-Crowley and like Helena Blavatsky and Himmler and a lot of these other people. But could you talk a little bit about Kenneth Grant and describe who he was?
Well, Kenneth Grant was an Englishman. He was born in the UK. He became a follower of Aleister-Crowley early on. Actually, he was Crowley's secretary for a year or two, I think, and wrote a book about that. Grant was very much influenced by Crowley and Crowley's theories about magic and religion and all of that. But at the same time, he realized that there were a lot of missing spots in what Crowley was presenting, particularly when it came to Eastern religion, for instance, Indian religion, Tantra, as an example, on the one hand, and Afro-Caribbean religion on the other. So Grant was trying to reintroduce all of this other material that Crowley had left out of his system. Grant was bringing in big batches. He was trying to formulate a kind of an idea of what Crowley's beliefs were, but expanding it into other areas and showing more of the Afro-Caribbean and Indian stuff, and some of the Chinese as well. So Grant was trying to be more encyclopedic, you might say, in his approach to occultism than even Crowley was. So he was more interested in actually the practice of magic itself than he was in Crowley's brand of religion, I would say. Crowley had a kind of his own religion called thelema, based on the Greek word for will. And I think Grant was much more interested in the actual workings of magic and occultism itself. You might call it shamanism or mediumship and channeling, all these New Age terms. But Grant was more interested in figuring out how that worked and in going much deeper than anyone had gone before. And I think that's what attracted him to Lovecraft. Lovecraft seemed to talk about extremes of experience, and I think that's what attracted Grant. So he wrote a lot, Kenneth Grant, but his most famous works are the Typhonian trilogies. These are a series of 9 books, 3 trilogies, that form basically his masterwork, if you will, on on his occult ideas and his occult terminology and his practices, involving bits and pieces of rituals that he and his group had conducted over the years as well. So it's very tough reading, a lot of it. It's his style is not the most accessible, and quite often he will throw around terminology that he doesn't explain, he doesn't define. So what led me to work on The Dark Lord was to try to understand what he was talking about and to provide a kind of guide to some of the terminology he was using so that people would understand more of what Grant was writing about.
Yeah, I've got that the Typhonian books. Have you read the Aleister-Crowley and the Hidden God?
Yes, sure. I've read all of them. So, yeah, pretty much.
What did you think of that one?
Well, I mean, that's one of Grant's earlier books. That started off the whole Typhonian Trilogy stuff, and it was extremely popular when it came out in the 1970s because the people that I knew at the time basically had very little background or grounding in any of this, and Crowley was sort of sitting there by himself. I mean, his works, of course, were pretty well known, but no one could really understand them or put them in any kind of framework. And I think Aleister Crowley and the Hidden God was an attempt to introduce the idea of Crowley to a larger audience, but also to explain what all this was about and give kind of a context for it. So it became very popular among the people that I knew at the time. They initially were very enthusiastic over Grant. It's only with the passage of time there was a kind of an alienation set in. I think you have to kind of know the politics of what was going on with the Crowley people at the time to really appreciate the tensions that arose between the British group of Crowley followers that Grant represented and then the American group of Crowley followers. And there was a split between the two and a lot of rancor between the two sides. So people started to fight over all of this, and they would see Grant as somebody who was not being orthodox in his approach. So it became stupid, and it became, just a lot of name calling and finger pointing, and the whole thing kind of fell apart. But Grant himself kept, steady of what he was doing and what he wanted to produce and present, and that's what he did. And there hasn't really been an American counterpart to that, to the extent that Grant was. This is getting into the weeds a little bit, probably more than you wanted, but it's there were theoretical and ideological differences, let's put it that way, between various cults that were following Aleister Crowley, and with Grant representing one perspective, one point of view, and the American groups representing another.
Yeah.
One thing about Grant that was interesting is the fact that the same way with Aleister Crowley is that they were so much into the sex magic. It seems like Crowley was really focused on that, and Kenneth Grant carried that on. Oh, sure. There's no doubt about that. Kenneth Grant's contribution was to go back to the tantric works. The books of Tantra are, in many cases, really focused on sexuality as a symbol of creation itself. So in order to go back to the moment of creation in Indian religious terminology, one goes back to this initial act between Shiva and Shakti, two deities in Indian religion. And Tantra comes out of that idea. So the Tantras are basically dialogues with Shiva and sometimes with Shakti as to, how did creation come about? How do you emulate it? How do you imitate it? Et cetera, et cetera. So Grant went right back to the Tantras, much more so than Crowley had. Grant wanted to see what was that all about? What was this sexuality, this religious sexuality all about? And probably the best place to look in those days was to go back to India, which had created an entire, very old and very traditional cult around sexuality, around a kind of divine or religious or spiritual sexuality, if you will, which involved yoga, which involved a lot of spiritual disciplines like meditation, but also in some cases involved sexuality, especially the Kaula chakras, the wheels that were run, the organizations that were run by what was sometimes called the left-hand path tantrikas. These were people who, according to the British, when they first went to India and they were appalled, these were groups that would conduct their religious ceremonies in cemeteries. And it involved sexuality in a cemetery.
And an Indian cemetery is not like a Western cemetery. An Indian cemetery is a charnel ground. I mean, bodies are cremated. So it's a really hideous sort of place if you're not used to that sort of thing. And that's where these rituals were being conducted. So the British, of course, tried to put a stop to it when the colonials came in, and they tried to, they wrote horrible, horrified books about all of this. But that was not all of Tantra. That was one aspect of Tantra. There were others that were far more elevated, you might say. Tibetan Buddhism, as an example, is basically a tantric Buddhism, which a lot of people don't understand or realize. But the central core text of Tibetan Buddhism, especially the Dalai Lama version of it, is the Kala Chakra Tantra. And that is a Tantra which, if you were to read it in translation, word for word, you might be shocked at some of the material that's in there. And yet the Dalai Lama performs these Kala Chakra initiations, or he used to perform them in front of, massive audiences, 100,000 people at a time, would start them off on this initiation in this cycle. So at heart, this is, in a sense, sexuality, but then so is a lot of occultism at its heart, and alchemy and everything else. That doesn't mean orgies, but it does mean that there's this focus on the positive, the negative, the male and the female, the yin and the yang, however you want to depict it. And it's there at the heart of this type of practice and this type of worldview, seeing the world as an interplay between these two forces.
How was he able to link the Atman that he believed in with the sex magic? Because that seems to involve other people, other entities, but the self, Atman, seems to be on the other side.
Well, yes, and to read Tantra, to read it carefully, is to come to the understanding that in Indian religion there is something called Advaita, which means non-duality. And there's Dvaita, which is duality. The goal, not just of the Buddhists, but also of the Tantrika, is to attain the state of non-duality. The Tantrika, the person who performs Tantra, does it by trying to unite male and female to achieve a third state, which is that state that you might refer to as Atman, or the state of non-duality, of oneness. So this is the goal, essentially. It's not sexuality in terms of mechanical reproduction, we might say. It's a union of two beings so that each one becomes essentially erased. At least their egos become erased in the process, and their identification with themselves becomes, as separate entities, becomes erased. So they achieve a kind of oneness. That's really the goal of it. The people who are performing a tantric ritual are no longer the human beings as we know them as for the ritual purposes. They become, let's say, a god and a goddess, or they become their higher selves. And then when they unite, they become a kind of third self. Both parties achieve a kind of state of oneness. That's the idea, anyway.
Fascinating. I'm going to turn it over to you, Chad. I know you have more questions.
Peter, did you see that Thelema was coming up in the Podesta emails?
Well, I didn't see Thelema coming up in the Podesta emails. I saw that Marina Abramovich came up in the Podesta emails, and there were a lot of associations and assumptions made that she was a Thelemite or a follower of Thelema. I know a lot of people in the Crowley organizations. I've known them for 20, 30 years or longer. And I think I can pretty much honestly say that none of them recognize her as being part of their groups. So I think it was an assumption that was made. People sort of tied it together because of some of her performance art, and they saw similarities between what she did and what they thought Thelema was. And I think that's where some of the confusion came in.
Well, actually, the word Thelema did come up in the Podesta emails. You're familiar with Hagman and Hagman?
Yeah, I'm familiar with them, right?
Yeah, they're actually they've talked about it a little bit, but I think they're putting a show together. They're going to do quite extensive on it, but yeah, the word Thelema has actually shown up in the Podesta emails.
I didn't see that. I mean, I looked through the Podesta emails because when all this came out, I was specifically interested in what they were saying and how they were saying it. People use terms like Thelema, they use terms like occultist and Satanist, and everybody thinks they know what these terms mean. But if you've actually worked in that field for a while, you know they mean very specific things. So to throw the terms around is kind of, it's just a little sloppy. So when it came to Thelema, I didn't find the word Thelema itself. I heard people talking about, the Podesta emails and using the term Thelema, of course. But I didn't see, Podesta himself, for instance, using the term Thelema. I could be wrong, but I've gone through hundreds of the emails. I just haven't found it, but it might be lurking there somewhere.
Yeah, if I run across that material, actually, I'll probably contact Joe and Doug and see if I can get them to send me the links for that so I can forward that on to you so you can check it out. Sure.
But like I say, the references to Marina Abramovich, I read all of that material, and that was pretty tame. So, it depends how you feel about her, about performance art in general, I suppose. But like I say, I was born and raised in New York, and for us, this is sort of, this is just business as usual. I mean, performance artists we have all the time. We have street artists and performance artists and gallery performance artists, and I've known performance artists, and they're a little crazy maybe, but, as far as being Satanists or occultists, that's a whole different story.
How do you think that the occultists from back then, like Lovecraft and Crowley, Parsons, Kenneth Grant, all of them, how do you think that they have influenced society to this day? Because it still lingers, and it seems to be in full force right now.
Well, in the first place, I don't think I would call Lovecraft an occultist. I think he would roll over in his grave if he heard you talk about him that way.
Oh, sorry.
He was dead set against being put into that group. He made fun of them, in his writing and in his correspondence.
That's true.
And he sometimes held them up as being very suspicious. In The Call of Cthulhu, he talks about theosophical cults, trying to raise Cthulhu and stuff. So he was against all of that. He didn't, hang out with them. He didn't like it. He just liked it as something he could use for his stories because it was imaginative and creative and spooky. So that's the extent. But the others you mentioned, Parsons, of course, and Crowley and Grant and the others, were very much, occultists. I guess there's no other way to describe it. To put them all in the same basket, you would call them occultists. And the influence is in different ways. We may talk about a cultural influence on the one hand, and then there's the sort of influence that we can't really put our finger on that I write about in Sinister Forces, which is an influence that's not unique to occultists. Occultists may represent what is taking place on the unconscious level of most of us, or unconsciously in our society, or in civilization in general. But a lot of people are, how shall I say, manipulated in a sense by occult ideas without being aware of it, without being, without signing on to it. I think that there are forces underneath political events that we can find occult reasons for, but that's kind of creative thinking. That's not necessarily coming up with evidence you could take to court. It's not that kind of thing. For instance, Lee Harvey Oswald is one of my favorite cases. Oswald was definitely not involved in occultism. This guy was, for a long time was a believing communist, which means an atheist. Communism atheism is embraced by communism, religion being the opiate of the people, as Karl Marx wrote. So here is a guy who grew up in very strange circumstances, signed on to the Marines, defected to the Soviet Union, married a Russian woman who was the niece of a Russian military intelligence officer, came back to the United States, and winds up living first in New Orleans and then in Texas. And the funny thing is, he was surrounded by people who had occultist sort of connections and leanings, and yet he himself was never actually involved in any of that. And I write about this in Sinister Forces because it's documented, it's fact. It's not something that is speculative. It's something that the people involved actually wrote about openly, without perhaps understanding the context, but coming out and talking about it. So you had the people he was living with, and his wife and children were living with in Dallas, was a woman who was the daughter-in-law of a very famous man who was heavily involved in paranormal research. for all of his life. He was an engineer who gave up engineering after World War II to devote himself entirely to paranormal research, to ESP, yoga, astrology, everything. And this was motivated in part by meetings that he had with an American military officer who was also a medical doctor and a researcher who conducted a seance in Maine in 1953, contacting some other forces, alien forces, described alternatively as spiritual forces or forces aboard a spacecraft hovering over the Earth. And he was one of those people present at that contact, he and his wife, both. And their daughter-in-law has Lee Harvey Oswald living in her house in Texas. And she goes up and visits them in September of 1963. She comes back down and she gets Lee Oswald his job at the Texas School Book Depository, right? And I find that alone is so startling, especially the fact that she wasn't allowed to talk about it during the Warren Commission testimony that she gave. And the implications are astounding, but it gets worse or better, depending on your point of view, because one of the very famous contacts of Lee Oswald was a guy called George de Mohrenschildt, a very mysterious guy from Europe who was a CIA contract agent for a while, who seemed to work for U.S. Agency for International Development overseas and some other things that were going on that were very mysterious and very suspicious. And he was in contact with this same group of people, these same mystics, who had this particular seance in Maine in 1953. He was in contact with them as well on the other side. So Lee was surrounded by these people. And then in New Orleans, before he came to Dallas, Texas, he was surrounded by even more craziness. He was surrounded by people who were part of this wandering bishop environment, people like David Ferry and Jack Martin and Tommy Baumler and on and on. There's a whole bunch of names of people who were involved as fake bishops in a fake church that was being run as a front for intelligence purposes. So you had Oswald surrounded by all these people, yet Oswald himself didn't go to church and he wasn't religious. And we know from all of his writings and his books and everything else, there was not a mystical bone in this guy's body. And yet here he is set up essentially for the assassination. So this is, to me, is a kind of a picture of society in general. There can be things taking place behind the scenes of which we are not aware. And sometimes people are in the middle of an environment where there are people who have occult beliefs or spiritual beliefs, and then suddenly they do something strange or something outrageous. We don't know about the connective tissue. We don't know how that works yet. We don't know if, for instance, the people around Lee Harvey Oswald could be considered culpable or guilty of partaking in the assassination when their entire contribution to it might be some kind of weird spiritual concept. They didn't actually go and buy guns and bullets, right? They didn't set things up. And yet he was surrounded by people who were occultists. So what is the connection? We have to probe this more deeply. We have to understand this better than we do. Sirhan Sirhan, who shot Bobby Kennedy, is a case in point. Here was a guy fascinated by occultism. His notebooks are full of references to the Rosicrucians, to theosophy. He was hypnotized on several occasions before the assassination. So we know here's a guy who is very open and very sensitive to these forces. And then suddenly he winds up in the Ambassador Hotel and he shoots Bobby Kennedy. What's the connection? What's the connection between his interest in Rosicrucianism and theosophy and the assassination? Is there a direct, solid line connection? Did Rosicrucians and theosophists arrange that assassination? I doubt it very much. So what we have to do is find out what spiritual forces are at work in the world of which none of us may be aware on a day-to-day basis, but which does exist as a kind of a subconscious platform for a lot of our thoughts, our motivations, and our actions.
Now,
it's amazing.
The spiritual forces that you were talking about, goodness, I'm losing my train of thought here. The Lee Harvey Oswald, his wife's father-in-law, are we talking about the Nine?
We're talking about the Nine, yes. This was a group of 9 people in a seance that was conducted in Maine in 1953, which was sort of at the height of the UFO hysteria. We had the UFO sightings in July 52 over Washington, D.C., right?
And they were in contact with these entities that referred to themselves as the Nine, correct?
They referred to themselves as the Nine, but they also referred to the people attending the seance as the Nine because there were 9 of them.
Could you go into detail about all that?
Sure. What happened was a man called Andrija Puharich. Puharich was a scientist. He was an inventor. He was a medical doctor as well, but he was also in the army during the Korean War. He was fascinated by the paranormal, by ESP, psychokinesis, and all of this. And he gave lectures at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, which is where they do the chemical biological warfare, they used to. He gave a lecture to them on how to weaponize the paranormal, how to weaponize ESP and psychokinesis. So this guy was very deeply into these ideas and how to use them. How could you scientifically appropriate this type of power and these type of abilities? We know that the Soviets were involved in this as well. The Chinese were involved in it as well. There was a lot of interest in this kind of field at that time on all sides of the global political conflicts that were going on. So Puharich was very involved in this. But at the same time, he created around himself a kind of small circle of people who were extremely well connected. So you had Arthur Young, the creator, the developer of the Bell helicopter, a very important guy in the military-industrial complex, who then turned his back on it, basically on the military, on engineering in general, and devoted his life to studying the paranormal. His wife was Ruth Forbes. And that's the famous Forbes family, John Forbes Carey, for instance. It's that very famous Pennsylvania family in general, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. So you have the Forbes family; they're very important and powerful. Arthur Young is married to Ruth Forbes, and her best friend is Mary Bancroft, and Mary Bancroft worked for Allen Dulles in the World War II OSS days out of Switzerland. But Mary Bancroft was also Allen Dulles' mistress for a very long time. So there was a direct connection, Arthur Young and Ruth Forbes to Mary Bancroft and Allen Dulles in that direction. But they're also the in-laws for Ruth Payne in Texas and her husband Michael Payne. Michael Payne was Ruth Forbes' son by a different marriage. So it's just that connection alone, but that wasn't enough. You also had a DuPont in that circle, and you had an Astor, as in Waldorf Astoria or John Jacob Astor. So you had a member of the Astor family, a member of the DuPont family, of the Forbes, and you had Arthur Young, an inventor of the Bell helicopter, plus, of course, Andrija Puharich. And you had a man from India called Vinod, who was very prominent in Indian social circles and in the World Council of Religions and that sort of thing. He was a kind of a prominent peacemaker activist type. And he was acting as the medium for this particular seance. And so he was sort of channeling these 9 forces on this spacecraft in low Earth orbit somewhere. And he's channeling their speech, and he's acting as the communication medium between the 9 wealthy people, these blue-blooded Americans on the ground, people who are involved with the military-industrial complex as well, and he's the medium, the intermediary between them and the 9 beings, these interstellar beings, these extraterrestrials who are now communicating and saying, "We are 9, and you are 9," and basically giving them their marching orders to go out and create change in the world. So this happened in 1953, and other families got brought on board. The famous Borden family, as in Borden's milk, Borden's dairy. One of the Bordens was involved with this group as well, and on and on. So you had some theosophical connections. You had definitely a military intelligence connection and a chemical biological warfare expert in Andrija Puharich, or someone involved with Edgewood Arsenal, at any rate. And it branched out from there. Puharich was the guy who discovered Uri Geller, for instance, the Israeli psychic, the guy who was bending spoons. And he brought Geller to the United States to be tested by experts to see if his psychic abilities were genuine. So he worked with a lot of these people. He was sort of a touchstone for a lot of important people who were very much interested in the paranormal and what it implicated. What were the implications of paranormal abilities? Did they exist? Could they be used? How could they be exploited or developed? Puharich was involved in this. And so we have that happening in 1953. And then 10 years later, there's the assassination. And the assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas in November can be shown to have these direct connections back to the Nine, back to Arthur Young and Ruth Forbes through Ruth Payne and George de Mohrenschildt and all the others. I mean, how do you explain all of this in rational terms? You know, how do you sit there and say, well, there's nothing to see here, move along? You know, there's obviously something to see here. The problem is we can't see it yet because we have to define what actually happened. We have to understand these forces a lot better to know what this was all about. Was it possible that the Nine wanted Kennedy dead for some reason? I find that hard to believe. And yet they might have been operating as channels for something darker. Maybe it's something darker that's just in the American psyche. I've written about the United States and America in general as being a kind of haunted house. You know, there were civilizations here long before we got here. We don't recognize their existence, really. We tend to build on top of their sacred sites, the Indian burial mounds that are all over America that represented a civilization that was quite ancient. We're sort of wandering around a haunted house, you know. So is it possible that there are forces in our psyche as Americans, as people born and raised in this land, that acts as a channel for some of these forces in some way? Is it just America? Of course it's not. It's the world in general. If we talk about the Kennedy assassination, as an example, we have Maurice Maeterlinck, the very famous Belgian playwright. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He wrote a play called The Cloud That Lifted, and it almost anticipates exactly the assassination of John F. Kennedy. There's a grassy knoll. There are shots fired. We don't know how many. There's some dispute over that. The man who fires the shots is a guy called Alec, and Alec was the name that Oswald had when he lived in Minsk in Russia, and it's the name that he used to buy the Mannlicher Carcano that he used essentially or officially anyway to kill Kennedy. It was sent to a guy called Alec Heidel, and Alec in the play said that he worked for Russia. I mean, all of these elements are there in this play that was written and published and performed before Jack Kennedy was even born. So I am very interested in these kinds of sinister forces. What I do, though, is I back off from saying, you know, Maurice Maeterlinck was part of the conspiracy. Obviously, he wasn't. So he's channeling something. He's sensitive about something the way Lovecraft was. Seeing something as an artist and as a creative person, seeing something that's at work without even realizing it, acting as a kind of channel for this information and putting it out there without knowing that later on these things will come to pass.
Wow, that's very interesting. I had no idea that you know, that was all tied in with the Nine. I figured that's what you were alluding to, and I wanted to get clarification on that. And also, real quick, when you were talking about the weapon, when they were weaponizing this, are we getting off into the grounds of like Project Montauk and stuff like that?
Well, kind of, in a way. You know, definitely when it comes to MK Ultra, and when it comes to the Operation Bluebird, which started in 1950. Bluebird is named Bluebird. We don't know why it's called Bluebird, except that from my point of view, because I'm seeing these various connections, I believe that Bluebird was definitely the name chosen because of the same Belgian playwright, Maurice Maeterlinck. His most famous play is Bluebird. And it's about the Bluebird of happiness, right? It's about these two kids who on Christmas Eve leave their home in search of the Bluebird of happiness. And if you read the play, and you know, there was a film made with Jane Fonda, of all people, and Anita von Pallenberg, I think, was in it, who was implicated in all sorts of weirdness around the Manson family. Well, let's leave that aside for a second. Let's just look at the play the way it was written. If you read the play the way it was written, it's like a course in brainwashing and mind control and in conspiracies. If you just read the play the way it was written, and I mentioned that in Sinister Forces, I kind of dissect it a little bit. And I think that I think Bluebird was named deliberately after that play and after Maurice Maeterlinck, who was himself a mystic, by the way, somebody very much involved in mysticism and occultism and theosophy, which informed a lot of the books that he wrote. He wrote about life after death and a lot of mystical things. You can find his non-play, his pure prose texts available still, and some small publishers are putting them out. He was very much involved in mysticism, and he wrote these plays, one about the assassination and one about Bluebird, which could have been used exactly as the blueprint for, creating MK Ultra eventually, but starting as Operation Bluebird. And the idea that we can manipulate consciousness is at the root of shamanism. It's at the root of a lot of the New Age practices of going into the unconscious mind and changing it, manipulating it, cleaning it out maybe, purifying it, and attaining higher altered states of consciousness. MK Ultra was doing that, but they were doing it with a sledgehammer. And they were doing it on innocent people who didn't know what they were in for. And it was conducted, Bluebird and MK Often and MK Ultra and all the other groups, all the other projects that came out of it, including in the military, which is a whole other issue. They were using these techniques, but without giving the victims any kind of spiritual safeguards. When you undergo a spiritual initiation in a secret society, in a cult, no matter what you may think of them, you are given ways in which to protect yourself. You are trained, you are disciplined to a certain extent, so that the initiations are gradual. They don't come all at once. They don't derange your mind. You're able to get them on board little by little and accommodate what you experience and have a context for it. That's the whole point of these initiations. But with MK Ultra, with the scientists of Bluebird and Operation Artichoke and MK Often and MK Ultra were doing, they were using the initiation procedures extracted from the spiritual aspects of it. They were just going to use the mechanics of it to see what they could get. So they would wipe people's memories, as was the case in the famous case up in Canada, in Montreal, with Ewan Cameron, one of the doctors working for MK Ultra. He specialized just in erasing your entire personality. It was called depatterning and psychic driving. He used all kinds of horrible, what we would consider torture today, techniques in order to create people who no longer had memories and no longer knew what they were doing or why they were doing it, and to give subliminal messages and controls to these people. In MK Ultra, we used heavy doses of LSD, massive doses of LSD on unsuspecting people, just to see what would happen, just to see if it was possible to create a different person. We used hypnosis to see if we could create the perfect assassin, someone who would kill without having a memory as to why they killed, without even having a memory of the orders that told them to kill. So all of this was taking place. We look at it as psychological manipulation today because we compartmentalize so much. But a couple of hundred years ago, or even 100 years ago, this would be considered a spiritual process, an occult process, a magical process maybe. This would be considered in the same realm as initiations, but done without any accountability or any responsibility at all, just taking some innocent person off the street and seeing if we initiate them all at once, in one go, with maybe a massive a dose of LSD, plus all sorts of other torture techniques. Let's see what happens. This is horrifying to someone who has studied religion, as I have for so long. What they were doing, these were religious techniques in the hands of bureaucrats, and that's what's scary.
And another thing that I wanted to backtrack on that you brought up about, you said that communism usually is tied in with atheism. Now, isn't it a well-known fact that Karl Marx himself, in his book Morals and Dogma, he talks quite extensively about Luciferianism, that he was basically a Luciferian. And it wasn't just him, it was like Helena Blavatsky and quite a few of them. I mean, they talk about Lucifer like he's Jesus Christ.
That wasn't Karl Marx. Morals and Dogma was written by one of the founders of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. No relationship to Karl Marx. Marx was Jewish, but he wrote a text called On the Jewish Question, Die Judenfrage. And what he was doing, he was trying to formulate the idea of human rights as a hoax perpetrated by Jews to defend themselves. So he was definitely anti-religion, Marx, as well as Engels, his partner. These guys they despised organized religion, despised religion in general. And Karl Marx, who was Jewish, went so far as to despise the archetype of the Jew in his mentality, which was the capitalist par excellence, right? And he figured that the human rights thing was just a mask, a smokescreen that the Jews had developed in order to protect themselves. Because if you were in favor of human rights for everyone, you had to be in favor of human rights for Jews. So Marx had this really weird concept that he promulgated. But Morals and Dogma was written by another guy.
Yeah,
Morals and Dogma
was by Albert Pike. I don't know why I was thinking Karl Marx all of a sudden.
Yeah, and Albert Pike, of course, did talk about Luciferianism, absolutely. I mean, and so did Blavatsky. I mean, the Theosophical magazine for a long time was called Lucifer. So, I mean, the idea that they had, however, was kind of similar in a way to the idea the Yazidis have, but just generally similar. But the Blavatsky idea and the Albert Pike idea is that Lucifer it's a Latin term that means the one who brings the light. And it's similar to the Greek idea of Prometheus, who brought the light from the gods to humanity and was punished for it. Lucifer being punished for bringing the light to humans as well. So they redesign the idea of Lucifer according to which they felt that Lucifer was on their side, on the side of humanity, bringing the light to humans. The Yazidis believe something kind of similar. They believe that Satan, or who they call Shaitan, was the first fallen angel. And he fell because he disobeyed God's orders to bend the knee to Adam and Eve. And Satan said he refused to do that because he had first promised God to bend the knee to no one except God. So when God told him to bend the knee to Adam and Eve, he thought it was a test. So he refused to bend the knee, and he was thrown out of paradise. The Yazidis believe that Satan will be the first of all of God's creatures to be welcomed back into heaven at the last days, which is why they revere Satan. You see, you can take these concepts and turn them around in so many different ways that are inconsistent from what, a mainstream Christian would think about Satan or Lucifer. And so when we use the term Satanism to refer, for instance, to the Yazidis, we got to be careful as to how we describe it, right? Because it's not Satanism like worshiping a horned god and, in a temple with, blood sacrifices or orgies or something. The Yazidis are not into that at all. But they have a different kind of approach to the whole concept of Satan. It's a very ideological, theological approach. That's why I'm so hesitant to fall in on one side or the other of all of these, new scandals that come out constantly, because there's a need to define what we mean by terms, and we don't always share the same vocabulary. We don't always mean the same thing when we talk about things. So we have to be careful where that's concerned. We have to know really what it is we're discussing before we can level the kinds of charges that are sometimes leveled. Because remember what happened at Salem. You just have a kind of an hysterical circumstance, and then 19 people are executed on the basis of what I call, or what Cotton Mather used to call, spectral evidence, evidence that nobody can really see, but people claim they see it, and therefore it must be true. And that kind of approach is something that I'm very nervous about all the time, because that can be used to call anybody anything. It's really hard to defend yourself against some of these charges that are leveled. You can't prove a negative quite often. That's really hard to do.
Well, Peter, as we're getting ready to close out, I have one more question for you. You had mentioned Manson. How does he fit in with all this?
Yeah, it's kind of what started me on this whole thing. There was a line in a book by Ed Sanders on the Manson family, and he said, if the Pentagon ever formulates the Manson secret, we're all in trouble. And I thought to myself, wow, that's a luminous line. If the Pentagon ever formulates the Manson secret, what is the Manson secret, and how could it be weaponized? And that set me off on the road. I actually visited the places where Manson grew up, where he was born and where he was raised. I did a lot of that research just to try to get a feel for the place, a feel for the environment to understand this. And Manson had a horrible hideous childhood. I mean, absolutely horrible. Spent most of his time in institutions. But at some point, something happened. He actually went through Scientology training, among other things, when he was in prison just before he was released the last time before he committed or ordered to be committed the Manson killings, the Tate LaBianca killings. He went through Scientology training. He went through all sorts of spiritual kind of mind control stuff while he was there deliberately. I mean, he wanted to go through this. And when he came out, he suddenly became this charismatic leader. Now, Manson was this short little guy, and he had this sort of very thick accent, and he actually, for most of his life, had never learned how to read. He only learned how to read in prison. This was a guy with virtually no real educational background who suddenly came out and became a charismatic leader and was able to make all of these people from all various backgrounds do whatever it was he wanted them to do. And that was the Manson secret. How did he do that? You know, what was behind it? How did he manipulate consciousness? And that's why I became fascinated with Manson, with his connections, with the things that he did, with his lyrics, with the music. I mean, he wrote a song called Bluebird Over the Mountain. You know, and after we've all been talking about Bluebird, or I've been talking about it endlessly, this whole Bluebird connection suddenly struck me. Here's Manson writing a song about a bluebird. Goodness, you know, was this a hint? Was this a shout out, you know, to the people who were involved in Operation Bluebird? So these things made me fascinated about Manson. So the third volume of the Sinister Forces Trilogy is called The Manson Secret for that reason. I really go into the nuts and bolts of what Manson might have been doing.
Didn't he also have ties with the OTO as well?
I don't think so. There was a tie to occultists of various kinds in San Francisco, and I write about that a little bit. And there might have been a tie to the famous Boy in the Box episode in Southern California with a kind of renegade OTO organization, but even that's pretty tenuous. There was, however, a tie to the Process Church of the Final Judgment, and that's pretty solid. Manson wrote for their magazine, and he was interviewed by the Process Church to the point where they actually had to go and shut him up because he was claiming he was a Process member or even a Process leader at one point. So there was that connection. And with the Process, we get linked back to Tommy Baumler, the lawyer who came up with that title, the Process Church, and who incorporated the Process Church. And Tommy Baumler was one of the fake bishops that was around Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans. So these little connections get tighter and tighter and tighter the more you look at them.
That's very interesting.
Yes, it is. Things that, as you said, Peter, on just your day-to-day level, you don't see this.
No, you don't. If you pay attention and you look for the facts, and the facts are there, the truth is much stranger than the fiction, believe me. The truth will set you free in this case, and it really will. If you look at the truth, if you look at the facts clearly and objectively, you're going to find that things are much stranger than you think they are. And that all the WikiLeaks stuff and the Reddits and everything else out there, they're doing a kind of Kabbalistic analysis of stuff. But if you actually look at the actual facts, you're going to find something that's far more interesting and far more, how shall I put it, chilling in some cases than the stuff that's been spun out around the WikiLeaks stuff. So look carefully, because I've been doing that my entire life. And when I actually do the research and I go to these places and I talk to these people and I look at the documents and I start to pay very close attention, you find things that you just wouldn't believe, you know. But it takes a lot of work, unfortunately.
You have to dig below the surface. Don't just take what's on the top, but get into the meat of it.
Absolutely.
Peter, where can people find you, and where can they purchase your books and give all the audience out there that information so that they can get in touch with you and they can purchase your books?
Sure. Of course, I have a website. It's my name. It's peterlevenda.com. I blog on there. I post on there irregularly, but I get spasms when I do a lot of it, and then I just don't do anything for months. But I'm also on Facebook, inevitably. I had to join Facebook the last 6 months or so. So I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, I'm afraid to say. So they can reach me in all those places. But Amazon, of course, is where you'll find all of my books. Everything is there. And on Barnes & Noble, of course, as well. So I'm pretty easily accessible that way.
Well, we really appreciate you taking the time to come on with us. It's been a fascinating hour. It went by so quick.
That's because I'm long-winded.
Oh, no.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yes, very interesting and very informative.
Yes.
We definitely would love to have you back anytime you want to come back. In fact, I would definitely like to get you and Gary Wayne together. He's the author of the Genesis 6 conspiracy book. And, I mean, he talks a lot of especially like when you brought up Rosicrucian, I was like, oh, Gary Wayne would be all over that.
Yes.
Well,
that would be interesting.
Keep me posted. We'll see what we can do.
Sounds good.
Awesome.
Okay, you want to close us out?
Sure will. Okay. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this time of fellowship and for leading us tonight. Please bless the listeners and carry through the week, Father, and please look after Peter and bless him and just everyone. And we appreciate everything that you do, Father, and for giving us this opportunity to fellowship and to share what needs to be put into the light. Please look after Chad, myself, and once again, Father, we love you and we just cannot praise you enough. In Jesus' holy and mighty name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone that's tuned in. We pray that you all have a blessed week. And that's it for tonight, folks. Good night, everyone.
All right.
Into the night, I raise my hand to the fire, but it's no use, 'cause you can't stop it from shining through. It's true, baby, let the light